Not all foraging has to be serious sustenance seeking. Sometimes it's just nice to sample the trailside nibbles mentioned in foraging literature, and none, in my opinion, are more pleasant to pick than edible flowers. They're a nice bit of flavor that can freshen your mouth after a long hike and offer some guileless, fun foraging. Their contribution to the forager is more for the spirit than the stomach. They won't fill your belly like a meal, but they can make beautiful garnishes, wonderful teas, interesting appetizer toppings, and bright salad inclusions, and of course, just plain enjoyment in the wild. These edible flowers can also be an enjoyable way to introduce young children to the delights of foraging. Of course, no child should ever be directed or encouraged to indiscriminately eat flowers. Some, like lily of the valley, are toxic, but when supervised by a knowledgeable adult, foraging for edible flowers can open their eyes to an exciting botanical universe. So all that said, here's some blossoms that are safe and delicious to eat on the trail or in the kitchen. But first, my obligatory foraging admonition. We've covered the basics of foraging safely and responsibly in our earlier article and video on the subject, but I would be remiss if I don't repeat the important instructions I stated there. Only eat a wild plant if you are 100% sure of its identity. That's why I list the scientific name of every species for you to reference. If ever you have that wavering uncertainty, take that as a red flag that you need to build up more knowledge before you put any plant in your mouth. This video, for instance, does not give you enough information to identify the plants that I'm mentioning if they're unfamiliar to you. This is merely meant as a stepping stone in an interesting direction. Do the research, find someone knowledgeable to teach you, and when it comes to wild food, don't guess. Also, don't forage from places that are at risk of contamination, such as roadsides, sidewalks, heavy use public areas, or beneath power lines. Pesticides and herbicides aren't things you want to carelessly consume. They are killer chemicals after all. So all that said, let's get into some different types of edible flowers. First one, wood sorrel from the oxalis species. Often misidentified as clover, the wood sorrel plants are a common denizen of field and forest edges. Their leaves consist of 3 heart-shaped leaflets that connect to a thin, delicate stem. In my area, violet wood sorrel, Oxalis violacea, and yellow wood sorrel, Oxalis stricta, are the most common. Blossoms have 5 petals, and after blooming turn into tiny bitty banana-shaped seed pods. Like the sour-tasting leaves and sour-tasting seed pods, the blossoms of wood sorrels are a bright burst of flavor. You'll find yourself surprised and delighted by the intensity of the tart, lemony essence. Yellow wood sorrel will bloom through much of the summer, and it is the sorrel species most likely to inhabit suburbia. Violet wood sorrel blooms profusely in the spring, and then sometimes has a bizarre encore blooming in the early fall, rising above the ground with blossoms alone, and nary a leaf to be seen. Sorrel blossoms are a delicious sandwich topping and also add a nice acidic zing to fresh Vietnamese-style spring rolls. Dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. Dandelion blossoms are a sign of happiness and warmer weather coming, and a true marker that winter is finally over. I always smile at the first brave bits of sunny yellow that somehow emerge when I'm still wearing wool socks and sweaters. The blossoms have a bit of the dandelion leaf characteristic bitterness, but it's paired with a nectar sweetness that makes them a delight to eat. Kids also love eating dandelions too, both for the flavor and being able to eat something so ubiquitous. Or maybe because they like the horrified look on Grandma's face when she sees her grandchildren chewing on the lawn. Folks have brewed dandelions into wine and soda for ages as well. You should check out our earlier article on the subject in the description box below. Just be sure that no creatures are enjoying the blossoms before you do. That cache of sweet nectar is a jackpot for bees and ants. If you don't give the blossoms a good shake and inspection before popping them in your mouth, you might actually accidentally eat more than you bargained for. Redbud, Cercus canadensis. An ephemeral treat, redbud blossoms only appear for a brief time in early spring and well before any tree has leafed out. You'll be able to find redbud at the margins of a forest in early April. It will be a lovely shade of pink that stands out from the barren-looking branches on the rest of the trees. These trees are typically 20 to 30 feet in height and have distinctive alternate heart-shaped leaves in the summer. Redbud has smooth gray bark and is often a graceful calligraphic shape. Blossoms and unopened buds taste like sweet peas and have a pleasant texture. They're excellent on their own, but they can also become a delightful edible garnish on a cheese tray with homemade crackers. As with all edible flowers, remember that the blossoms you eat won't be able to sustain spring butterflies or become an edible sea pod later, so I recommend browsing each redbud branch lightly. Violets of the viola species. In early April and May, violets grace the unsprayed lawns and fields of the world. The leaves of every species vary a surprising amount, but their distinctive blossoms show their family ties. They are 5-petaled, but the petals are irregular, with 2 distinctly paired on the top, 2 to each side, outstretched, and 1 at the bottom that often has purple streaks. The violets you see here are common violet, Viola sororia, and bird's foot violet, Viola pedata. Common violet has abundant edible leaves as well as those beautiful purplish blue flowers. If you really want to harvest of violet blossoms, however, bird's foot violet is the most generous. The profusion of lavender, white, and blue streaked blossoms can be absolutely carpet-like, though I admit I often can't bring myself to gather them when they're thick like that. I'd rather just take in the view and be thankful for a new spring. The blossoms look pretty and taste rather bland, but I can't resist. Perhaps it's their sweet, crisp texture and the tiny burst of sweetness. Blossoms are a dazzling salad garnish on that, and both blossoms and leaves make a healthful and tasty tea that's even nicer with a swirl of wildflower honey. Red clover and white clover of the Trifolium species. One of my earliest foraging memories from childhood is picking the individual florets from a red clover blossom and dabbing that sweet nectar on my tongue. That same sweetness can be enjoyed by a forager of any age. While the blooms of both white clover and red clover can be eaten raw in a salad, I suggest making them a little easier to eat by breaking the flower heads apart and scattering the pieces like a garnish. They're also a lovely inclusion in soup or mixed in a greens dish, but my favorite way to enjoy them is in a tea, especially those red clover blossoms. Clovers are high in mineral content, which means they can take up heavy metals and pesticides from polluted soil. Be sure to forage for these plants in places you know that aren't contaminated. Black elderberry, Sambucus nigra. Blooming in snowy profusion as the summer heat rolls in, black elderberry is a plant that always is associated with the sound of crackling cicadas and sunburn. The 5-petaled flowers are clustered in an impressively huge umbel that produces a strong, somewhat sweet, somewhat musky aroma. The flowers make a delicate honey-scented tea that is irresistible when a few of the starry blossoms are scattered across the surface. Again, remember, when you remove blossoms, you stop them from developing into berries. Wild creatures adore the berries, and they're a wonderful food to forage later. So gather blossoms thoughtfully. Elderberries are common, so it should be easy to take just a few flower clusters from every plant you find rather than clearing a single plant of all the edible flowers. But an alternative gathering method is to shake the blossoms from a loaded plant into a ready container. The bitty petals of already fertilized flowers will rain down into a bowl, along with a few spiders and leaves, but that will give you plenty to brew while still allowing the plant to make edible berries later on in the summer. Finally, don't confuse black elderberry with red elderberry, Sambucus racemosa. Red elderberry blossoms emerge later in the season and form a flat flower head rather than black elderberry's domed poof. The fruit of red elderberry is often considered toxic, and I can't find any good information on the edibility of the blossoms, so let's just skip that plant. Now, of course, there are far more edible flowers than these, of course, but I haven't tried them all yet. But others can include basswood flowers, kudzu, daylily, black locust flowers, hibiscus, and lilac. Please use this list as a starting point. If you happen to know those plants and have access to them, research how to eat and when to use them, and share your edible flower stories in our comments below. Do you have any that you look forward to nibbling, or do you have similar childhood memories connected with foraging flowers? We'd love to hear from you.